Lieutenant Sarah Chun had always been smaller than everyone else around her. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing just 125 pounds, she looked more like a college student than someone who had just completed one of the most grueling military training programs in the world. But appearances could be deceiving, and Sarah had learned that lesson the hard way throughout her entire life. Growing up in a rough neighborhood in Detroit, Sarah learned early that size meant nothing when you had heart and determination. Her father, a former Marine, had taught her that respect was earned through actions, not given because of rank or reputation. When bullies at school tried to intimidate her, she stood her ground. When coaches said she was too small for competitive sports, she proved them wrong by becoming state champion in wrestling at 118 pounds. The Navy had been skeptical when Sarah applied for the Special Warfare Program. Women had only recently been allowed into combat roles, and the physical demands were intense. Many questioned whether someone of her stature could handle the rigorous training alongside men who outweighed her by 70 or 80 pounds. The instructors pushed her harder than anyone else, expecting her to quit within the first week, but Sarah had something that couldn't be measured in height or weight. She had an unbreakable spirit and years of training in multiple martial arts. While other recruits struggled with the mental pressure, Sarah thrived on it. Every insult, every doubt, every whispered comment about her being in the wrong place only fueled her determination to prove everyone wrong. Commander Jake Morrison was a legend in the special warfare community. At 6 feet 2 inches and 210 pounds of solid muscle, he embodied everything people expected from a Navy SEAL. He had completed multiple combat deployments, earned numerous commendations, and commanded respect from every person who served under him. His reputation was built on being the toughest, most skilled operator in any room he entered. Morrison had been commanding special operations units for over 12 years. He believed in old-school military traditions and had serious doubts about integrating women into elite combat units. In his mind, warfare was about physical dominance and raw strength. He had seen too many good soldiers get hurt because someone couldn't pull their weight when it mattered most. When Morrison first saw Sarah's file cross his desk, he shook his head in disbelief. Her test scores were impressive, and her training reports showed exceptional performance, but he couldn't get past her physical measurements. In his experience, smaller operators were liabilities in close-quarters combat situations where brute force often determined who lived and who died. The base where Sarah was assigned buzzed with gossip from the moment she arrived. Everyone knew about the new female officer who had somehow made it through training, and opinions were sharply divided. Some younger soldiers were curious and supportive, while others, particularly the veterans, remained skeptical about her abilities. Morrison made his position clear during Sarah's first briefing. He explained that his unit operated at the highest level of military excellence, and there was no room for weakness or special treatment. Every member had to prove themselves worthy of wearing the unit's patch. Regardless of their background or training credentials, Sarah listened quietly to Morrison's speech, nodding at appropriate moments while studying his body language and tone. She had encountered this type of resistance before and knew that words would never change his mind. Only action would earn his respect, and she was prepared to do whatever it took to prove that she belonged. Among the elite operators, the other unit members watched the interaction between their commander and the new arrival with intense interest. Everyone knew that Morrison had never been shy about expressing his opinions, and they wondered how this dynamic would play out in the coming weeks. Some felt sorry for Sarah, knowing how demanding Morrison could be with new team members. Others were curious to see if she really had what it took to survive in their world. As Sarah settled into her quarters that first night, she reflected on the challenges ahead. She had overcome every obstacle placed in her path so far, but she knew the real test was just beginning. Morrison's reputation preceded him, and she understood that earning his respect would require more than just meeting expectations. She would need to exceed them in ways that nobody anticipated. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. Two strong-willed individuals with completely different perspectives on military service. were about to clash in ways that neither fully expected. Sarah's determination to prove herself worthy would soon meet Morrison's unwavering belief in traditional military hierarchy, creating a situation that would test everyone's assumptions about strength, skill, and what it truly meant to be a warrior. The tension between Sarah and Commander Morrison became apparent during her first week with the unit. Morrison assigned her to the most physically demanding tasks, clearly testing whether she could handle the workload that came with special operations duty, while other new arrivals received gradual integration into unit activities. Sarah found herself thrown directly into the deep end during morning physical training. Morrison personally supervised Sarah's performance. He watched as she completed obstacle courses, carried heavy equipment loads, and participated in endurance runs alongside much larger teammates. To his surprise, she kept pace with everyone else, never complaining or asking for modifications to accommodate her smaller frame. The other unit members began to take notice of Sarah's consistent performance. Sergeant Mike Torres, a respected veteran with 8 years in special operations, found himself impressed by her technique during weapons training. While Morrison focused on her physical limitations, Torres observed her precision, tactical thinking, and ability to adapt quickly to new situations. Morrison's skepticism only deepened as Sarah continued meeting every challenge he presented. He had expected her to struggle or request assistance, giving him justification for his doubts about women in combat roles. Instead, Sarah's competence forced him to escalate his testing, pushing her harder than any new team member in recent memory. During a particularly grueling training exercise, Morrison decided to make his point publicly. He announced that Sarah would participate in close-quarters combat drills against male teammates, starting with progressively larger opponents. The entire unit gathered to watch, sensing that this moment would define Sarah's future with the team. The first opponent was Corporal Danny Hayes, a lean but muscular soldier with extensive martial arts training. Sarah studied his stance and movement patterns before engaging, using speed and technique to compensate for the size difference. She managed to hold her own during the drill, earning grudging nods of approval from several observers. Morrison wasn't satisfied with Sarah's adequate performance. He called forward Sergeant First Class Kevin Park, a former college football player who outweighed Sarah by nearly 80 pounds. Park had a reputation for being gentle during training, but Morrison specifically instructed him to treat this as a real combat situation without pulling punches. The match between Sarah and Park lasted longer than anyone expected. Park's superior reach and strength gave him obvious advantages, but Sarah's agility and precision kept her competitive. She landed several clean strikes while avoiding his most powerful attacks, demonstrating skills that impressed even the most skeptical observers. As word spread about Sarah's performance in combat drills, Morrison felt pressure to definitively prove his point about physical limitations in special operations. He began planning a scenario that would test every aspect of her capabilities while highlighting the importance of raw strength in combat situations. Morrison announced a special training exercise for the following week. He explained that it would simulate a high-stress combat scenario requiring both individual skill and unit cohesion. Every team member would be tested, but Morrison made it clear that he expected this exercise to reveal the true capabilities of all personnel, especially newer additions to the unit. Sarah spent her evenings preparing for the upcoming challenge. Knowing that Morrison was specifically targeting her performance, she reviewed combat techniques, studied unit protocols, and physically conditioned herself for whatever scenarios Morrison might devise. Other team members quietly offered advice and encouragement, beginning to see her as a legitimate teammate rather than an unwelcome addition. The night before the exercise, Sarah encountered Morrison in the base gym during her late training session. He watched silently as she practiced combat movements, noting her dedication and technical proficiency. For a brief moment, his expression softened slightly, but he quickly returned to his stern demeanor when he realized she had noticed his observation. Morrison approached Sarah after she finished training, speaking more directly than he had since her arrival. He explained that special operations demanded absolute excellence from every team member, and that lives depended on each person's ability to perform under pressure. He stressed that his testing wasn't personal, but necessary to ensure unit effectiveness. Sarah responded respectfully but firmly, acknowledging Morrison's concerns while making it clear that she was prepared for any challenge he might present. She expressed her commitment to proving herself worthy of serving alongside the unit's experienced operators. Regardless of how difficult the path might be, the conversation marked a subtle shift in their relationship, moving from open hostility toward grudging mutual recognition. Morrison still doubted Sarah's capabilities, but he began to respect her determination and professionalism. Sarah understood that earning his full acceptance would require something more dramatic than simply meeting expectations during routine training exercises. As both prepared for the upcoming confrontation, neither fully anticipated how dramatically the situation would soon change. Morrison's confidence in his physical superiority and Sarah's quiet determination to prove herself were about to collide in ways that would surprise everyone involved, including themselves. The morning of the special training exercise arrived with unusually high tension throughout the unit. Morrison had designed a comprehensive combat scenario that would test every aspect of special operations skills, from weapons proficiency to hand-to-hand combat under extreme stress. The entire base seemed to know that something significant was about to happen. Morrison gathered the unit in the main training facility, explaining the exercise parameters in detail. Each team member would rotate through different combat stations, facing increasingly difficult challenges designed to push them beyond their comfort zones. The final station would feature close-quarters combat against multiple opponents, simulating real-world situations where operators might be overwhelmed by enemy forces. Sarah noticed that Morrison's eyes lingered on her as he described the most physically demanding aspects of the exercise. She understood that this was his attempt to create a situation where her smaller stature would become a decisive disadvantage, potentially justifying his doubts about women in special operations roles. The exercise began with weapons training and tactical movement drills. Sarah performed exceptionally well in these areas, demonstrating the marksmanship and strategic thinking that had earned her place in the unit. Her precise shooting and quick decision-making impressed observers, including some of Morrison's longtime supporters who had initially shared his skepticism. As the morning progressed through various challenges, Sarah continued performing at the same level as her male colleagues. Her endurance during long-distance carries, her accuracy under pressure, and her ability to maintain composure during simulated combat stress all met or exceeded unit standards. Morrison watched carefully, noting her performance while waiting for the moment when physical limitations would become apparent. The tension reached its peak when the exercise moved to the final station featuring close-quarters combat scenarios. Morrison had arranged for team members to face multiple opponents simultaneously, creating overwhelming odds that would require both skill and physical strength to overcome. He positioned himself as one of the primary opponents, ensuring that he would personally test Sarah's capabilities. When Sarah's turn came, Morrison stepped forward as her primary opponent, with two other large team members serving as additional challengers. The setup was clearly designed to overwhelm her through sheer numbers and size advantages. The entire unit gathered around the training area, sensing that this moment would determine Sarah's future with the team. Morrison explained the rules with a slight smile, emphasizing that this was a realistic combat scenario where hesitation or inadequate response could mean death in actual operations. He stressed that all participants should treat the exercise as seriously as real combat, using full force within safety parameters to ensure authentic training value. Sarah studied her three opponents carefully, analyzing their positions, strengths, and likely attack patterns. She had faced similar odds before during her martial arts training, but never with stakes this high or observers this critical of her performance. Everything she had worked for throughout her military career would be decided in the next few minutes. Morrison initiated the exercise with aggressive forward pressure, using his size and reach advantages to immediately put Sarah on the defensive. The two additional opponents moved to flank her, creating the overwhelming tactical situation that Morrison had designed to prove his point about physical limitations in special operations. For the first few moments, the scenario unfolded exactly as Morrison had planned. Sarah found herself retreating under pressure from three larger opponents, struggling to maintain defensive positions while looking for opportunities to counterattack. Several observers began to nod knowingly, thinking that Morrison's point about physical requirements was about to be proven definitively, but Sarah had trained for exactly this type of situation throughout her life. Instead of continuing to retreat, she suddenly shifted tactics, using her opponent's expectations about her limitations against them. She moved with explosive speed and precision that caught all three men off guard, exploiting gaps in their coordination that larger opponents often created through overconfidence. Morrison realized too late that he had underestimated both Sarah's skills and her strategic thinking. As he pressed forward to maintain pressure, she executed a perfectly timed counter-movement that used his own momentum against him. What happened next would shock everyone present and change Morrison's perspective about combat effectiveness forever. The exercise had become more than just training. It had evolved into a defining moment that would reshape everyone's understanding about what made an effective warrior. And Sarah was about to demonstrate that heart and skill could triumph over size and assumption in ways that nobody had anticipated. The moment Morrison lunged forward with his full weight behind the attack, Sarah saw her opportunity. Years of martial arts training had taught her that bigger opponents often became overconfident, committing too much force to attacks and leaving themselves vulnerable to counters. Morrison was making exactly that mistake right now. As Morrison's 210-pound frame barreled toward her, Sarah dropped low and pivoted sharply to her right. His momentum carried him past her intended position while she positioned herself for a devastating counterstrike. The two flanking opponents hesitated for a split second, confused by the sudden change in dynamics, and that hesitation would prove costly. Sarah's counter-movement was perfectly executed. As Morrison tried to recover his balance from the missed attack, she drove her elbow upward with precise force into his exposed ribcage. The impact was clean and powerful, targeting the exact spot where his forward momentum and twisted position made him most vulnerable to injury. The sound that followed was unmistakable to everyone in the training facility. A sharp crack echoed through the room as Sarah's elbow connected with Morrison's ribs, followed immediately by his gasp of pain and surprise. The commander, who had been demonstrating his physical dominance just seconds earlier, suddenly found himself struggling to breathe and maintain his footing. Morrison staggered backward, clutching his side where Sarah's strike had landed. His face showed a mixture of shock, pain, and disbelief as he processed what had just happened. The man who had never been seriously challenged in close-quarters combat had just been decisively defeated by the smallest member of his unit. The two flanking opponents immediately stopped their attack, realizing that their commander was seriously injured. The training exercise came to an abrupt halt as everyone present tried to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The facility fell completely silent except for Morrison's labored breathing and attempts to assess his injury. Sarah stepped back immediately after delivering the strike, her training and professionalism taking over despite the dramatic turn of events. She could see that Morrison was hurt and needed medical attention, but she also knew that showing excessive concern might be interpreted as weakness or guilt by observers who were still processing the situation. Sergeant Torres was the first to react, moving quickly to assist Morrison while calling for medical personnel. Other team members gathered around their injured commander, some shooting glances at Sarah that ranged from impressed to shocked to uncertain about what this meant for unit dynamics moving forward. The base medic arrived within minutes and immediately began examining Morrison's injury. After careful assessment, he confirmed what everyone had suspected from the sound of the impact. Morrison had suffered at least 2 broken ribs from Sarah's precisely delivered strike, requiring immediate medical treatment and several weeks of recovery time. As Morrison was prepared for transport to the medical facility, He made eye contact with Sarah across the training room. His expression was complex, containing pain from his injury, but also something else that surprised her. Instead of anger or resentment, she saw what appeared to be genuine respect and perhaps even admiration for her skill and technique. Word of the incident spread throughout the base with incredible speed. Within hours, everyone knew that the small female officer had seriously injured the legendary SEAL commander during a training exercise. Reactions varied wildly, from those who praised Sarah's skill to others who questioned whether the exercise had gone too far. Colonel James Wright, the base commander, immediately called for a full review of the incident. He needed to understand exactly what had happened and whether appropriate safety protocols had been followed during the exercise. The military took training injuries seriously, especially when they involved senior officers and situations that might affect unit cohesion. Sarah found herself in an uncomfortable position following the incident. While she had simply responded appropriately to the training scenario Morrison had designed, she now faced scrutiny about her actions and their consequences. Some viewed her as a hero who had proven herself against impossible odds, while others saw her as someone who had injured a respected commander. The investigation revealed that Morrison had specifically designed the exercise to test Sarah's capabilities under overwhelming odds. Multiple witnesses confirmed that he had instructed all participants to use full force and treat the scenario as realistic combat training. Sarah had followed those instructions precisely, using legitimate defensive techniques to protect herself against multiple attackers. Morrison's injury forced him to take medical leave, just as his perspective on Sarah and women in special operations was beginning to change. From his hospital bed, he reflected on the skills and determination she had demonstrated, recognizing that his assumptions about physical requirements in combat had been challenged by someone who possessed qualities that couldn't be measured in height or weight. The incident had transformed Sarah from a questioning addition to the unit into someone who had definitively proven her capabilities under pressure. But it had also created new challenges, as she now needed to navigate the complex dynamics of having seriously injured her commanding officer, while simply doing what military training demanded. The official investigation into the training incident took 3 days to complete, during which Sarah found herself in a strange position within the unit. Some team members treated her with newfound respect, while others remained uncertain about how to interact with someone who had hospitalized their commander. The atmosphere on base became charged with tension as everyone waited for the investigation results. Colonel Wright personally interviewed every witness to the incident, reviewing video footage from multiple angles and consulting with medical personnel about Morrison's injuries. The evidence clearly showed that Sarah had acted within the parameters of the training exercise, using legitimate defensive techniques against overwhelming odds, exactly as Morrison had instructed. During her interview with Colonel Wright, Sarah maintained complete professionalism while explaining her actions during the exercise. She emphasized that she had simply responded to the scenario as designed, using the skills and techniques that had been drilled into her throughout her military training. She expressed concern for Morrison's injury while standing by the appropriateness of her defensive response. The investigation concluded that Sarah had acted properly within the rules of engagement established by Morrison himself. The colonel's report noted that the exercise had been designed to test combat effectiveness under realistic conditions, and Sarah had demonstrated exactly the type of decisive action that special operations demanded in life-or-death situations. When Morrison returned from medical leave 2 weeks later, the entire base watched carefully for his reaction to seeing Sarah again. His ribs were still healing, requiring him to wear protective padding and avoid strenuous physical activity. The proud commander, who had never shown vulnerability, now moved with obvious discomfort that served as a constant reminder of the incident. Morrison's first action upon returning was to request a private meeting with Sarah. The conversation took place in his office, with both individuals uncertain about how to address what had happened between them. The power dynamic had fundamentally shifted, and both needed to establish new ground rules for their professional relationship. To Sarah's surprise, Morrison began the meeting by acknowledging her exceptional performance during the exercise. He admitted that his assumptions about physical requirements in special operations had been challenged by her demonstration of skill, technique, and mental toughness. His injury had forced him to reconsider what truly made an effective combat operator. Morrison explained that his initial skepticism about women in combat roles had been based on traditional thinking about warfare that emphasized raw physical strength over other equally important capabilities. Sarah's performance had shown him that modern combat required a more nuanced understanding of what constituted effective fighting ability. The commander made a remarkable admission during their conversation. He acknowledged that Sarah had become a better operator than many men he had worked with throughout his career, and that her presence actually made the unit stronger rather than weaker. His broken ribs had become a symbol of his own evolution in thinking about military effectiveness. Sarah responded with characteristic professionalism, thanking Morrison for his honesty while expressing her commitment to serving the unit with distinction. She made it clear that she harbored no resentment about his initial skepticism, understanding that trust had to be earned rather than simply granted based on credentials or training records. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship, transforming them from adversaries into mutual respecters of each other's capabilities. Morrison began actively supporting Sarah's integration into the unit, using his influence to ensure that she received the same opportunities and responsibilities as any other qualified operator. Word of Morrison's changed attitude towards Sarah spread throughout the special operations community, influencing other commanders who had harbored similar doubts about women in combat roles. His public support carried significant weight due to his reputation and combat experience, helping to open doors for other qualified women seeking similar opportunities. Sarah's performance during the exercise and Morrison's subsequent endorsement established her as a role model for women entering special operations fields. Military academies began using her story as an example of how determination, skill, and proper training could overcome traditional barriers in elite combat units. The unit dynamics continued evolving as team members adjusted to having Sarah as a fully accepted colleague rather than someone whose capabilities were still being questioned. Her tactical skills, physical conditioning, and mental toughness earned her assignments to increasingly important missions, proving that Morrison's faith in her abilities had been well placed. Morrison's broken ribs eventually healed completely, but the lessons learned from his encounter with Sarah remained with him throughout the rest of his career. He became an advocate for evaluating military personnel based on actual capabilities, rather than assumptions about physical characteristics, helping to change policies that had historically excluded qualified candidates. The incident that had begun as Morrison's attempt to prove Sarah's limitations had instead demonstrated the danger of underestimating opponents based on appearances. Both individuals had grown professionally from the experience, with Sarah proving her worth and Morrison expanding his understanding of what made an effective warrior in modern combat operations. 6 months after the training incident that changed everything, Sarah found herself leading her first major operation as the unit's newest team leader. Morrison, now fully recovered from his injuries, had specifically recommended her for the promotion, based on her exceptional performance in subsequent missions and training exercises. The woman he had once doubted was now responsible for the lives of operators who had initially questioned her presence. The mission briefing took place in the same training facility where Sarah had broken Morrison's ribs, as she outlined tactical plans to her team, including several operators who had witnessed that pivotal moment. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. She had transformed from someone fighting for acceptance into a leader others looked to for guidance in dangerous situations. Morrison attended the briefing as an observer, watching with evident pride as Sarah demonstrated the leadership qualities he had failed to recognize during her early days with the unit. Her tactical analysis was thorough, her contingency planning comprehensive, and her ability to inspire confidence in her team remarkable for someone so young in her career. The operation itself was a complete success, with Sarah's team accomplishing their objectives without casualties or complications. Her leadership during the mission earned praise from higher command and solidified her reputation as one of the unit's most promising officers. The skills that had once been questioned were now being used to train new operators joining the unit. During the post-mission debriefing, Morrison publicly commended Sarah's performance and leadership. He spoke about how her success had challenged his own assumptions and made him a better commander through forcing him to reconsider traditional approaches to evaluating combat effectiveness. His endorsement carried significant weight throughout the special operations community. Sarah's story began spreading beyond their immediate unit, inspiring other women considering careers in special operations and combat roles. Military recruiters used her example to encourage qualified female candidates who might have been discouraged by traditional barriers or skeptical attitudes from established operators. Her success opened doors that had previously been closed to women with similar capabilities. The relationship between Sarah and Morrison evolved into one of mutual mentorship, with each learning from the other's perspectives and experiences. Morrison's tactical experience and institutional knowledge complemented Sarah's innovative approaches and fresh insights about modern warfare. Their collaboration made the entire unit more effective and adaptable. Morrison later admitted in interviews that his injury had been the best thing that could have happened to his career and understanding of military leadership. The broken ribs had forced him to confront his own biases and expand his definition of what constituted an effective warrior. He became a vocal advocate for merit-based evaluation rather than assumptions based on physical characteristics. 3 years after the incident, Sarah was promoted to major and given command of her own special operations unit. Morrison, now a colonel himself, spoke at her promotion ceremony about the lessons learned from their early encounters and how she had transformed his understanding of combat effectiveness through her example and performance. The training facility where their confrontation had occurred was eventually renamed in honor of breakthrough moments in military integration. A plaque was installed commemorating the importance of evaluating personnel based on demonstrated capabilities rather than preconceived notions about physical requirements in combat roles. Sarah continued advancing through military ranks, eventually becoming one of the youngest women ever to command a special operations brigade. Her success inspired policy changes throughout the military, leading to expanded opportunities for women in combat positions and revised training protocols that emphasized skill over size in close quarters combat scenarios. Morrison remained in touch with Sarah throughout their careers, often consulting with her on training programs and personnel evaluation procedures. Their professional relationship had grown from initial antagonism through mutual respect into lasting friendship based on shared commitment to military excellence and effective leadership. Years later, when Morrison was asked about the moment his perspective on women in combat changed, he would point to Sarah's precision strike that broke his ribs. He explained that the injury had been less important than the realization that his assumptions about combat effectiveness were fundamentally flawed and needed to be completely reconsidered. Sarah's legacy extended far beyond her individual achievements, inspiring systemic changes in how the military evaluated and developed combat personnel. Her story became required reading in leadership courses, demonstrating how determination, skill, and proper training could overcome traditional barriers and transform institutional thinking. The woman who had once been told she would never measure up to male special operators had not only proven herself equal but had redefined what excellence looked like in modern military service. Her confrontation with Morrison had been more than just a training exercise. It had been a catalyst for positive change that benefited the entire military community for generations to come.